Hello, and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 21, A Dream Fulfilled. The day of Lydia and Wickham's departure soon came. No one, except Mrs. Bennet, was sorry to see them go. Happily, Mrs. Bennet had something to think about. She heard news that Mr. Bingley was shortly to return to Netherfield. Jane had also heard of his coming and quickly brushed, though she was quick to add, "The news does not affect me one way or the other." Elizabeth did not know what to make of this. Was her sister still in hiding her true feelings? She thought that Bingley was still in love with Jane. "As soon as Bingley comes, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "you will go visit him. In any event, I will invite him to dine with us." So anxious was Mrs. Bennet to send an invitation that she counted the days until it could be done. Then on the third morning after Bingley's arrival, she saw him ride towards the house. Jane kept her place at the table, but Elizabeth went to the window, and what a surprise she got! Mr. Darcy was Mr. Bingley. Both sisters looked at each other in amazement. What could this mean? Mrs. Bennet received Mr. Bingley with a great deal of civility, but she could barely pay attention to Mr. Darcy at all. She was too busy filling Mr. Bingley in on the news of the neighborhood, even telling him about Lydia's recent marriage as if it was not anything of a problem. Elizabeth sat quietly and watched everything. She noted with pleasure how Bingley looked at Jane. He clearly found her as beautiful as ever and spoke to her eagerly. Elizabeth and Darcy, who was not seated next to her, spoke very little, but they could not help glancing at each other frequently. When the gentlemen rose to go, Mrs. Bennet invited them to dine at Longbourn in a few days' time. As soon as they left, Elizabeth went for a walk by herself in order to think. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and confused her. Why did he only come, if only to be silent? Why didn't he speak to me? What if he no longer cares for me? She worried. She didn't have long to ponder these questions. On Tuesday, the dinner party assembled. Bingley quickly found himself next to Jane. He was very attentive to her all throughout dinner. Elizabeth believed that if it were left to him, he and Jane would eventually be married. Sadly, Mr. Darcy was far from Elizabeth as physically possible. In fact, he was seated next to her mother, a situation that could please neither of them. Her mother's manner to him, coupled with a sense of all they owed him, upset Elizabeth deeply. She would have given anything in the world to be able to thank him for all the kindness he had shown Lydia. Instead, she followed him with her eyes. Darcy walked to another part of the room. She envied anyone he spoke to. How could I ever be foolish enough to expect a renewal of his love for me? What man could ever propose to a woman a second time? She was pleased, though, to bring him coffee and seized the moment to speak in. "Is your sister still at Pemberley?" she asked. "Yes, till Christmas," he replied. She could think of no more to say, and unfortunately neither could he. And at long last, after a woman whispered something to Elizabeth, he walked away. Then her mother proposed all playing cards, and Elizabeth's spirits dropped. There's no chance of speaking to him now. Mrs. Bennet did not care anything now except the future prospects of her eldest daughter. She had seen enough of Bingley's behavior to convince that Jane would finally be his bride. A few days after the visit, Mr. Bingley called again at Longbourn. He was alone. Mr. Darcy had left the morning for London. "Make haste, Jane," advised her mother. "Mr. Bingley is here." At first, all the Bennets, except Mr. Bennet, who had fled to the library, were in the drawing-room. It took some time before Elizabeth was able to move from the room and leave Jane and Bingley alone. When she returned, she saw Bingley and her sister together at the hearth, engaged in earnest conversation. Elizabeth turned to go when Bingley suddenly rose, whispered a few words to Jane, and ran out of the room. "Oh, Lizzie, I am so happy. I must tell Mother instantly. Mr. Bingley has gone to speak to Father," Jane declared. Elizabeth, left to herself, smiled. She was delighted that her sister's love affair was well settled to last. All the previous months of suspense and unhappiness were over. In a few minutes she was joined by Bingley, whose talk with her father had been short and purposeful. "Where is Jane?" he asked. "Upstairs with my mother." Elizabeth smiled. He immediately came to her, claiming the good wishes and affections of a sister. Elizabeth expressed her great pleasure at their coming marriage, when they shook hands with great affection. Indeed, it was a happy day for all in the Bennet household. Jane, I am happy for you, announced her father. You are both ideally suited for one another. Mrs. Bennet, who thought Bingley the handsomest man ever, was forever exclaiming over his wealth and position. Bingley, from that time on, was a daily visitor at Longbourn. He frequently came before breakfast, and always remained until after supper. Jane was happy that all the truth was finally known. Did you know, Lizzie, he told me when he left last November he really loved me. Nothing would have persuaded him to leave except he thought I was indifferent. I'm glad they now knows how much I love him. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.